Good afternoon. I'm Roger Smith, the chair of the Penn Program on Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism, welcoming you to the second event in our 2012-2013 faculty workshop series on Constitution making. We began last month at the National Constitution Center with a lively debate on the topic of whether the world is rejecting American constitutionalism, whether specific provisions or even the more general principles of American constitutionalism are or are not being embraced in the wave of constitution making that the world has seen, particularly over the last 2 to 3 decades. And to continue that discussion, we could not do better than to have our speaker today, Thomas Ginsburg of the University of Chicago. Tom is the Spitz Professor of International Law, the Wolf Research Scholar, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He has degrees both in law and political science from Berkeley, and I can testify that probably the most exciting development in public law scholarship over the last couple of decades in this country has been the increased attention to comparative public law, comparative constitutionalism, fueled in part by the spread of constitutional systems and increasingly powerful courts in different parts of the world. And Tom Ginsburg has, over the last dozen years or so, established himself as certainly one of the international leaders, if perhaps not the single most influential voice on issues of comparative constitutionalism and comparative public law. He's produced a lot of award-winning scholarship. He currently co-directs with Zachary Elkins the Comparative Constitutions Project, funded by the National Science Foundation, that's putting together an indispensable body of data for assessing constitutionalism. I know from his scholarship and our previous discussions that Tom tends to be, in regard to our topic last time, somewhat more enthusiastic and optimistic about American constitutionalism as a model for the world than I tend to be. But I tend to think that's because I have focused so heavily on the American constitutional system, and I see all its flaws and failures, and Tom actually knows something about the rest of the world, and thereby is able to see often some strengths. Now, our discussant today is Greg Urban, the Arthur Hobson Quinn Professor of Anthropology here at the University of Pennsylvania. He has all his degrees from Chicago and many highly acclaimed publications. Most of you know that Greg has been a pillar of the Penn Program on Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism since its inception, as well as being a pillar of the University of Pennsylvania more generally. I didn't realize until recently that in his remarkable breadth of interest, he has an interest in comparative study of constitutions, and so I knew there would be no one better in keeping with our relentless insistence on interdisciplinary dialogue to discuss Tom's presentation than Greg. Now, because we did have some difficulties distributing the paper, we know that not all of you have read it, and we're going to adapt. Tom, instead of our usual 20 minutes, we'll talk a bit longer, laying out the basics of the paper up to a half hour or so. Greg will discuss for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion in our usual lively fashion. So let's welcome Tom Ginsburg.
Thanks very much, Roger. It's an extraordinarily generous introduction, and it's great to be here back at Penn. I was visited here about 6 years ago for a semester. Enjoyed it a great deal. Since many of you haven't read the paper, those of you who have, forgive me for repeating the joke that's at the outset. There's an old Soviet joke where a Russian goes to an American and says, "What's the difference between the Soviet Constitution and the American Constitution?" The American looks at both documents and says, "You know, I'm not really sure." And the Russian says to the American, "Well, you know, in our Soviet Constitution, we have freedom of speech. In your Constitution, the American Constitution, you have freedom after speech." And I suppose it's in this sense that I think that the United States might be a model for the world. I would certainly not go around advising other countries to adopt it. But I think the joke captures this intuition that many of us have, that constitutions in authoritarian regimes are simply shams. They're fig leaves. They're not designed to do anything. And that's what I want to interrogate in the pair of papers that I distributed. So I distributed really 2 half papers in the hope that they might add up to something that's a complete paper. The first is actually an introduction to a volume I'm editing based on a conference we had last year at Chicago on authoritarian constitutions. And there's several contributors to that. And so there's kind of a synthetic introduction, and I'll say a little bit about that. The second paper is my chapter in that volume, and it's a contribution using data from this large data set, the Comparative Constitutions Project, which I'll say a little bit about as a matter of introduction. It's using data from that to interrogate whether the form of authoritarian constitutions is different at all from the form of democratic constitutions. So the content's really very different. And so, without further ado, I guess to move things along, let me just say a word about the general project I've been working on for 5 or 6 years now. The idea is to put together a database which can, on the contents, the formal contents only of national constitutions. We would like to perhaps look at things like court cases and other super statutes and other things that we might call constitutional. We face some pretty significant problems of comparability there, and so we simply restrict our analysis to the formal texts of constitutions. We think it's a useful baseline if you want it for people who want to assess to what degree constitutions matter. And it's an ambitious project, 1789, actually not to 2006, through the present, for all independent countries. What's the Constitution? Well, that's really easy. In most countries' cases, there's a single document that is called a constitution. There are a few exceptions. Saudi Arabia formally has no constitution because the Holy Quran is the constitution. New Zealand just has a series of statutes. Israel has a series of statutes that they call basic laws. Essentially, our decision rule is if there's something called a constitution or a basic law, that's the Constitution. If not, like the Saudi case, we look at laws that are either create or suspend a branch of government or a Bill of Rights, and that would be the Constitution by implication. For Britain, it's just too bloody complicated. We just leave it out entirely, though we're now beginning to think about whether we could figure out, identify something that there would be a consensus on as being the British Constitution that we might code. Fortunately, these sort of outliers aren't very common, and so we don't feel too badly about that. This sort of demonstrates the extent to which the written Constitution itself has spread over time. So each of these bars here is the number of new constitutions written in a particular year from 1789. And you see that constitutions, interestingly, do tend to come in waves, typically following major international conflict. That's often an excuse for constitution making or a trigger. The top line here is the number of countries in the world, roughly quadrupling since 1789. The bottom line is the number of countries with written constitutions. And so one thing that you see over time is that the form itself spreads. Eventually the 2 lines converge, so that any country that comes into existence today as their first act, South Sudan maybe is the most recent to join the sample, they pass a written constitution. So it's become a real norm. And I suppose this goes to the debate you had at the last session. The overall project is interested in 3 questions. How long do constitutions endure? One of the reasons the project has taken so long is because most constitutions don't last very long. In our book we published a couple years ago, we find that the average lifespan of a national constitution for all countries is only 19 years. And so that's troubling, and we try to analyze why that's the case. this project about authoritarian constitutions is really about the content. What's in the form? You know, why is it that some institutions spread, others don't? What are the determinants of the forms of constitutions? And finally, I guess the big $100 million question is, do they matter? And the Soviet joke sort of informs that question. What's the correspondence between the law in the books and the law in practice? There's a side benefit, I suppose, a collateral benefit to the project, which is trying to inform constitutional design. And, you know, in any given year there'll be 5 or 6 countries that are writing a constitution or rewriting one. Most of the people engaged in those processes have never done it before and are never going to do it again. And they rely on, you know, advisors, and there's kind of a coterie of people who go around the world and do that. But data, I think, is also useful. And so we have these 2 websites, actually, which work on that. As an advertisement, we've just started a new blog, which is actually more on the scholarly side, with the journal ICON, the International Journal of Constitutional Law. That launched yesterday. That's all about the overall project. Why might we be interested in authoritarian constitutions? Well, one point is that the vast majority of all constitutions have been authoritarian. This looks at the entire percent of constitutions at any given time, and one sees that you know, the large swath here is authoritarian. Most constitutions, for most of the time, have been authoritarian. If you think about the origins of constitutionalism, right, the Magna Carta and such, we would characterize that today as an authoritarian constitution. It's about an internal arrangement within an oligarchy. And so we shouldn't assume that all constitutions are democratic. That's a very big mistake. And yet, I think there is a tendency to lump together authoritarian constitutions. When one thinks of the early history of it, right? I'm thinking now of Roger Myerson's work, published a few years ago in the American Political Science Review. He's fascinated by the court of the exchequer in England, whereby the king has a kind of constitutional arrangement that he's going to count the money that comes in from the nobles in front of all the nobles. And this is an important sort of commitment device. It's important for generating common knowledge among the nobles that the king is only punishing the nobles who are failing to honor the bargain. Without that kind of clarity, the whole constitutional arrangement would fail, right? And this is kind of a general problem of governance, one might say. It's an agency problem from the point of view of the nobles. It's a coordination problem. And to some degree, it's a pre-commitment problem on the part of the king to have a kind of credible way of making sure that he's only going to punish those who are misbehaving. So all those are kind of constitutional functions, and we see that the authoritarian regime of medieval England needed them. And I think that it's likely to be the case that authoritarians today face the same kind of problems, and so interrogating it, I think, is going to be quite interesting. Beyond that, I think authoritarian constitutions, constitution-making exercises, themselves are windows into regime practices that are otherwise quite invisible to us, right? When Stalin decides he's going to write a new constitution in 1936, he's doing that for some internal reason. He invests a tremendous amount of energy into the process. And actually, we now learn from recently declassified documents that there was a lot of internal discussion of the internal competition, and actually, apparently, even at one point, an intention on the part of Stalin to have competitive elections in the aftermath of that constitution. That is, what's written in the constitution, which is that there would be competitive elections for Soviets. They started to do that. So and this is usually seen as the paradigm of a sham constitution. So it's really, this line of research is just simply asking the question. All right, what might authoritarian, let me just make one other point. So because they're costly, right, for authoritarian regimes, that also implies that there might be something going on. Sometimes these exercises take a great deal of time. If one looks at the average amount of time that is required to draft a national constitution, there's great range. In our sample, the shortest amount of time was a 15-day period for a briefly living Romanian constitution in 1938. The longest are recent constitutions passed in Myanmar and the Maldives. And democracies tend to cluster in the middle, so that as we see at one end or the other, authoritarian regimes either taking a really short amount of time or a really long amount of time. The latter phenomenon suggests to me that the process itself might be part of the point. That is, the process of making a constitution will allow a leader to do all kinds of things that they might not otherwise be able to do. In the Maldivian case, which I recently looked at, it gave the president a whole bunch of new offices to put people into. You joined the Constitutional Assembly. That was 100 people that he could then exercise patronage over, evaluate, and so the project might be the point rather than the end product. It's just a suggestion. The volume characterizes the roles of constitutions probably everywhere, but particularly authoritarian constitutions, as playing four possible roles. So one is the window dressing function, and this is, I think, the intuition that many people have. The Constitution is designed to put up a screen that the outside will look at and believe that something is better inside the country than it is. It's a little bit of a puzzle why that would be effective, especially given the assumption that many people have that constitutions don't actually do very much. Why would the window dressing be believable? I suppose another possible way of thinking about the metaphor is that window dressing might be designed not for outsiders but for insiders. If you're Stalin and you pass a constitution which is utterly meaningless, in a way what you're saying to the people is that constitutions are meaningless in the West as here. It's just a piece of paper. So that's a kind of window dressing function, obfuscation. That's one possible role, and I think that's the one that most people focus on. Constitutions, though, we know everywhere function also as what we call operating manuals, right? That is, they are designed to lay out and create institutions of government and describe for those within the regime, allowing them to coordinate what institutions are going to do what. A third function is a billboard. A billboard is